Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's a large crowd. I guess it was the rain brought people in or something. But we're honored to be here, and we're really honored to be associated not just with the festival, but with Dolores Kohl, who is somebody we absolutely adore.
Yes,
a woman who is she's a visionary philanthropist and just has a level of intellectual engagement that I always find extraordinarily inspiring.
Inspiring is the word, yes.
Are you just going to repeat me what I say? I said
just going to repeat me what I say?
Okay, so we're here to talk about our recent book, and it came out in the beginning of the summer, but it's still getting a little attention. We were very happy this morning to wake up to a long review in the Washington Post called Why Economists Need Tolstoy, and we were really very, very happy with that.
So was Tolstoy, yeah.
I just ignore them usually. So we're excited about this book, but as Lou pointed out, this isn't our first rodeo, right? We've been writing books for a long time, and you're humanists, and humanists love to write those books. And I'm an economist. We mainly write somewhat technical articles. I try to do that, but I've also written a couple of books. You wouldn't know from the display since you carefully removed them and only left your own books, Saul. But I'm not going to even raise that, Lou. But anyway,
it's a good thing you didn't mention it.
I've never mentioned it. It's just not befitting my presidential stature here. So here's my first question for you, Saul. And we've done book talks around the world, actually, for the past couple of months. And we've done book signings, and we really enjoy this. We always learn from it, particularly the questions from the audience. But this isn't, you've written 19 books. I've written 9 books. But this book is different than the books I've written and the books that you've written, in that we usually assign our books to our classes, but this book came from a class. I want you to say something about that.
It's almost as if the students assigned it to us, because we've been teaching this class together, and we learn a lot from the students and their reactions to the class, and a lot of this book is the class notes. It came from an interaction with the students with the material.
So what's the class? We're about to teach it again. We were talking before about the syllabus. We're tweaking the syllabus a little. This would be, the 8th time, and we're going to start it when we come back from winter break in early January. We're going to do it again. So what's the course, and how does that give rise to a book?
Well, the class is about how different disciplines understand the concept of choice, whether there is choice, the theological debates on free will, whether time is open or closed. It involves readings in history, city planning, geography, and economics, thought of as a discipline about modeling choice. But the core idea is that different disciplines don't just treat different subject matter, they understand the world differently. They ask different questions. They make different presuppositions. They count different sorts of evidence as valid. And sometimes you can learn a lot by looking at the same material, the same set of questions, from the perspective of 2 different disciplines, because each one might think it has all the answer using its method, but it's left something out that the other discipline can see.
So we generally, and not just at Northwestern or Penn, where you used to teach, and I was once on the faculty, or Williams, or other places I've been, we usually leave it up to the students to make those connections, right? So if they're discussing something like urban poverty, it's rare to have an interdisciplinary course in the sense that you have an economist and a sociologist, an anthropologist, and others all together. Usually the students take a class, from someone in a particular department, and they make the connections. So you want to...
Or sometimes if you do it, you can do it by having, separate lectures each week from a different disciplines. There's one we're giving now that way at Northwestern on the Russian Revolution.
And that must work. That's probably good. It's a little different than what we try to do, because we try to make it really interdisciplinary. We don't
That's
do
right.
serial teaching, right? That
No.
you're on Tuesday and I'm on Thursday. When we first started doing it 8 years ago, there were some lectures that were mainly you and some lectures that were mainly me. But now we have the 10-minute rule, right?
Yeah, we each, we talk, and then we ask each other questions, and we argue. And students sometimes can be a bit confused. They're expecting somebody to tell them exactly what to believe, and they will write it down and regurgitate it for the exam. And here, if they say, well, which one of you are we supposed to believe? The answer is, you're supposed to think, And that's different because there aren't any clear answers. They really have, and the papers that they write have to engage in that way without a clear answer.
Well, I don't know about you. The reason I don't give them an answer is I don't know them, pretty much.
Yeah.
As you said, they're not really clear answers when we debate these things, and that's what's in the book. So should
right.
you have a market for selling kidneys and other organs? Should you change the way you do development economics? Should you do, and we have a lot. And the interesting thing is the course doesn't give credit for economics, even though this subtitle is What Economics Can Learn from the Humanities. Most people take the course for their distribution requirement to get credit for
Ethics and values.
ethics and values, because we try to, every topic and every lecture, we try to step back and say, okay, let's take a philosophical point of view, and let's just say, whether it's Aristotle or it's Rawls or it's Hume, how you would try to figure out what's the right thing to do, right?
Yes, and we start with the premise that there are real ethical questions without clear answers. By an ethical question, we mean not a sort of situation where you know what the right thing to do is but don't want to do it. That's not an ethical question. That's a question whether to be ethical. An ethical question is one where
Good distinction.
the answer isn't clear. I mean, you just don't know. There are good things to be said for different, and it's really an open question. And all the really serious questions that you encounter are of that sort. And, you may come to an answer, but new evidence comes in, and if you really want to do the right thing, you have to be ready to change your answer in response to changing conditions and evidence, or counter-arguments you didn't expect, or results you didn't expect.
So in the book, according to particularly the Washington Post, an earlier review in the Wall Street Journal, they said we're really hard on the field of economics. And again, the course and the book is What Economics Can Learn from the Humanities. So let me ask you, I'm a proud economist. We both recognize that you just talked about evidence. I don't know what other fields are better than economics for taking a dispassionate view of evidence. But yet, we think that economics can be improved, and yet, and we argue, and again, the Post really focused on that this morning, that economists are very insular. They look at different topics, but they look at it from typically a very narrow economic lens. But Saul, I have colleagues in my department at Northwestern and other places I've been throughout my career, they work on understanding human behavior. That's really a field of psychology, but economists do a lot of work on that, right? They work on the distant past, so that's history. They work on voting behavior, that's political science. They work on the cycle of poverty, that's sociology, anthropology, etc. So why do you think economists are insular when they work on issues that most people would consider are far outside the traditional domain of the discipline?
Well, they do it in a very particular way. The assumption is that you can just model other areas of human interaction the same way you model an economy, and use the same set of tools to do it. So all these things that look like difficult questions to sociologists or humanists or philosophers, they really are very simple. You just apply the standard economic model and you come up with an answer, and that's the right answer. Other disciplines can give us the questions. We economists, the idea that we have the answers, and that leaves a good deal. They do have something to contribute, even beyond talking about the economy per se, but they don't have everything to contribute. For example, there are all sorts of areas where to understand what's going on, to understand what is ethical, to understand what will work, you need to take culture into account, and people come from different cultures. And you can't take culture into account using economic ways of thinking because you can't mathematicize culture. You can't do the sort of formulas that they're used to. And so no matter what part of the world you're dealing with, where you're making recommendations, the recommendations cannot take into account that people have different values, that people are brought up with different presuppositions, different ways of thinking. That just you just get the prices right, you do the market right. And that is one of the important things, but if that's all you have, you're going to miss a lot, both in terms of effectiveness and in terms of ethical correctness.
So you mentioned evidence-based. Prove it. So what's the evidence that economists are more insular than political science professors, psychology professors, sociologists, historians, and the like?
Well, there was this survey. Marty, you have all the figures from the survey, where people were asked, and from different disciplines,
These aren't just people, these are professors at American colleges and universities. And what were they asked, Saul?
Do they have anything to learn from other disciplines that's worth knowing?
Can you imagine saying no to that question? I mean, is there anything you can learn from any other discipline? And it's something about the hubris of the academy that even the ones like the psychologists and the historian, they about 75, 80%.
That's the best you got.
The best you get was 80. I mean, can you imagine somebody saying, no, it's anthropology or death, right? I mean, it's like mind-boggling. But anyway, so almost every social science, Saul, was between 70 and 80%. But there was one social science who said, what percentage of economists said they can learn anything from any other field? What percentage, remember?
42%.
42%.
Which means so 58% think they can't.
58% of economists. There was, unfortunately, this study came out after the hardcover, but we're working on the introduction.
It's going into the introduction.
And it's now the beginning, and we've written op-eds about this. And the New York Times did this thing in a Sunday magazine section back in February, before the book was in print, but they were already publishing it, so it was too late. And they had a bold thing. They said, is there anything about economics that justifies 58% of the teachers in American colleges, universities, economists, who say there's nothing to learn from anyone else? And then the second thing, of the 40% of economists who said they can learn from another field, was it literature? Was it philosophy? What was the main thing?
Finance, basically.
Finance, which is economics again. I mean, can you imagine? So
most people, that's not another field.
Yeah, it's just a subfield within. I mean, that's the thing. I have this far-reaching view. I'm not this Neanderthal here. I think finance can. Come on. Anyway, and yet, I mean, is it that our behavioral models are so sophisticated, our predictions so accurate, our policies so effective and just? How can you understand, Saul, that level of hubris? It's not evidence-based, based on how successful we are in transforming the world. What do you think it is?
Well, there's a claim that they have achieved the status of a hard science, like Newtonian physics. And what Newton did, for astronomy in the 17th century, economists think they have done. Indeed, they originally modeled their discipline on the same sort of equations used to describe the solar system and its stability. And they think they've actually done it. And, there's a kind of fallacy there. It's sort of like, well, sciences use math, therefore if we use a lot of math, we're a science, which is a fundamental philosophical error, but then economists don't read philosophy,
Yeah.
And there is really this deep sense that, they have the science, and therefore, to go outside to these mushy-headed anthropologists or humanists, well, it's sort of like, would a physicist go outside and ask the man on the street what he thinks about matter? It's kind of that perspective, right?
And a corollary study of citations shows that a lot of people who are historians and political scientists and sociologists, they cite economists, but economists don't cite them. It's very unusual for an economist to cite anyone outside the field of economics. So you're a little hard on economics here, and I'm starting to get a little sensitive here, my friend. So what's good about economics then? I mean, if they're so narrow, that narrow focus, what's the line again you said? It's other fields have the questions, economists have all the answers. So what's good about economics?
Well, in some areas, particularly in microeconomics, economists really have achieved something. And I remember being quite impressed. A number of years ago, I found out what was in the Northwestern basic microeconomics class. And it was basically the same class that I had taken, I don't know, was it 50 years ago, something like that. It really was something.
God, you're old.
And that's a sign, and that is true of Newtonian astronomy too.
Yeah.
The basics haven't changed in micro. And macro, it keeps changing because they make predictions and they're wrong time and time again. And if you ask them, doesn't this show that you didn't get, the last financial collapse, didn't you? Or the one before that, doesn't that show that you maybe don't know as much as you think? The answer I usually get is, well, we now have a model that will account for it. So after the fact, they can adjust their model to explain it. But my answer to that is astrologers can do the same thing. It's not much of a test that you can explain something after it happened.
But I asked you what's good about economics, and you say it's better than astrology? I mean, come on, man. Is that,
It's sometimes
my
better than
department is ranked
astrology.
7th in the world. It's pretty damn
Yeah,
good.
but it's ranked by economists. The microeconomics really has achieved something. And what's more, economic ways of thinking really provide one framework. The assumption, for example, that people behave rationally, they sometimes do behave rationally. And when they do, this becomes a marvelous way of modeling it. Market solutions tend to work better than centrally planned ones. Not everybody's always thought that. Certainly in the Soviet Union, they didn't think that. But
that's, again, you're turning something that we do poorly. What about opportunity costs? What about efficiency? What about Pareto optimality? What about the Coase theorem? I mean, it's not just
those are
a couple of micro things.
All those are really
the way we look at data objectively, right?
You have it all over the humanists on that one.
Thank you.
I mean, no, I think if the question was, who is on better intellectual footing right now, economists as they practice their discipline, or we literary critics as we practice our discipline, the answer would be the literary critics are far behind.
High compliment there. So let me get, my wife Mimi always says, well, be specific. Lay out something that economists approach and maybe could approach better if they read literature. So the easy thing is to say, economists who work on a distant past should actually really embrace the field of history, as Joe Mokyr does, and Dick Easterlin, a number of the heroes of the book, as we lay out for everyone. It's interesting, the Washington Post talked about a number of the scathing parts of the book about all these famous people, including Nobel Prize winners. Didn't make a lot of friends with that. They neglected to say they were heroes of the book as well. But there are, in general, economists who work on the past should integrate history and cycle of poverty, sociology, et cetera, and anthropology. So let me give you some economic questions or policy dilemmas. And then, so in addition to, the easy thing is reach out to the other social sciences. It's more difficult. And how can you say you should ignore everything that psychology and political science and the like contributes? That's the easy thing. Even though economists tend not to do it, that's the easy part of the book. But then we go on and say, but philosophy is important. And we say, okay, well, then you have to argue that. But most people would say that. But literature? So if it's somehow Steve Mnuchin, who's the Secretary of Treasury, or Gary Cohn, Chief Economic Advisor for President Trump, if they were reading War and Peace, they'd be better. So I'm going to get to Mimi's thing. I'm going to give you a couple of things that have happened recently that economists have found very perplexing. They didn't anticipate it and they can't explain it. And you have to tell me specifically a novel that if they read would provide insight, okay? So that's an important challenge for you, so good luck with this. So the first one I want to say
we haven't done this before.
The sanctions that then President Obama put on Russia because of their escapades in Crimea, in the Ukraine, right? So what they did was they did economic sanctions. And you know how economists are very familiar with economic sanctions, whether on North Korea or Iran or any other country, that we always say, okay, the prices of imported goods are going to go up because, you know, what you're doing is making it very, you're reducing the supply relative to demand, so economics, the price goes up. And we can usually anticipate what governments are going to do. They're going to try to do end runs to try to get more in there. They might do subsidizing the price. They're going to try to increase availability whenever they can. And generally, that's what countries do when you put an economic sanction on them. But that isn't what Putin did.
No.
You know, we were completely wrong and shocked by what Putin did in response to not only US, but Western European sanctions on imported goods into Russia in 2014. So what did he do? And then tell me a book that would have helped us anticipate that action.
Well, what he did was, okay, you are going to prevent us from importing these goods. We're going to double the sanctions and not import even more goods. We're going to make your sanctions even harsher. That's how we'll teach you. And what's more, I just remembered this yesterday, we're going to prevent you from adopting our orphans too, which they did, you know, at that point. And you say, what? How does it make sense? You're going to hurt me, so I'm going to hurt myself more to show you what I think of you? But, you know, that any Dostoevsky novel will give you that characters who respond that way, right? Because it's a way in which people say, I'm not going to play your game. When, you know, I will hurt myself rather than be in your game because national pride is more important. Americans find this hard to believe. You know, if you lower your standard of living, that's going to put pressure on people. That's the most important thing in the world, right? It's not if you're a Russian, right? I mean, Americans assume that, Western Europeans, that governments exist in order to make individuals better off, to be happier. Mm-hmm. What else would they be for? But Russians tend to assume that individuals exist for the benefit of Russia. After all, the individuals, they're going to die. They're only here today, gone tomorrow. But Russia remains. The crucial thing is the country, the state. Russia is the important thing. And once you start thinking that way, and if you read not only Dostoevsky, you read, let's say, War and Peace, Tolstoy's novel, and their reactions to the French invasion. You read Vasily Grossman's novel about World War II, Life and Fate. You would see that this is the psychology there, and you can't count on everybody behaving the way Americans would behave. Mm-hmm.
So it's literature that it gives you insight into the cultural differences that would lead to very different consequences of economic intervention.
Yeah, right? That's right, yeah.
Okay, so that's one. Let me give you another one. I mentioned voting behavior before. There have been a couple of elections in the last few years that surprised a lot of pundits, right? Economists and others. The first one was Brexit. Because economists kept saying, if you get the word out that there are a lot of working class people, with Britain leaving the EU, it's going to adversely affect their standard of living. And clearly, if people are motivated by economic self-interest, if we could convince them it's against their interests, they will vote not for Brexit. And similarly with the election of President Trump, that people kept saying, oh, I'm going to bring back steel, I'm going to bring back coal. And a lot of people, certainly editorial after editorial in the New York Times by Paul Krugman, among others, was all, that's not true, that he's going to put in policies that are going to be really bad for the working class. And therefore, of course, you're going to vote for Secretary Clinton because you're going to vote your economic self-interest. So those were two shocking votes in a row. And the most shocking thing about the latter one of the presidential election here was that, they sort of wrote off Brexit. There were a couple of people who were saying, there's something going on here about the working class. And maybe it's not just that they're voting their self-interest or they've been deceived that somehow Brexit is good for their self-interest. Maybe something else is motivating them. And yet, even Nate Silver said, Trump had, what, 20% chance, 25% chance, or he was at my house the week
Something
before
like that,
about
yeah.
that and talked about that. And most people said that he had a 1 to 5% chance. So what about literature? I mean, is there anything that would have given us better insight into these votes that shocked the vast majority of people in England and Britain more generally, and certainly the US?
If you read great novels, you won't be surprised that most people do not define self-interest in terms of purely economic self-interest. Your sense of your own dignity can be much more important. Almost all realist novels will do that for you. And, you know, if people feel that you are talking down to them, that you regard them as utterly contemptible, you know, beneath notice, you know, stupid, evil. I mean, and they can sense it, and you certainly can sense it in, let's say, in Paul Krugman, right? I mean, whether they read him or not, that those attitudes are around. They might decide, my self-interest is in getting some respect, and I'm not going to do it by just following people who have contempt for me. You know, and that, I suspect, was the case in the Brexit and perhaps in the Trump one too.
And you think by reading certain literature, I mean, like Hillbilly Elegy, I just finished reading J.D. Vance. It's a great book. Did you read it?
No, I haven't read that one.
You should read it. It really is a great book. And I never would have read it if President Trump hadn't become President Trump. I mean, it became a big bestseller. So everybody, most people, certainly in academia, don't know all that many people who voted for him. Or if they voted for him, they're not public about this, right? And God, can you imagine in my business wearing that Trump button? You know, go far at Northwestern and the like. But anyway, so I think we're all, what happened? What just happened? So you read Hillbilly Elegy, and it's a very interesting view into people who feel not respected, left behind. And it wasn't economic self-interest that they were deceived. It was something else motivated them, right, Saul?
And that, you know, let's say, there are a lot of novels, let's say by Balzac or Dickens, about someone from the country coming to the city and having to adjust to a culture that regards country people as yokels. And what is their reaction to it? Sometimes Henry James does it, let's say, even with Americans in Europe who will have the same, get the same reaction. How do people react to something like that? How do you, as even a reader, react to it if you're, let's say, part of the group that is looked down upon? Well, you'll see that a great deal of the reaction is this emotional attempt to assert yourself, to not accept the framework that other people use to judge you and laugh at you. Above all, it's the, you know, the laughing that in these novels that tends to offend people. And you want to say to people, you know, you think those people are too stupid to know you're laughing at them, but that's a second insult, and they perceive both of them. You know. And you're not going to win them over by laughing at them or treating them as unable to understand that, right?
And there's something else, Saul, we argue in the book, and you mentioned Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground, the underground man, right? Because he made the point that he didn't talk about economics, but I can say as an economist, we believe people have an objective function, things that bring them utility or satisfaction, and there's a predictable response to changes in relative prices, changes in income, and the constancy of taste. So you could actually work out your equations and figure out what you think is going to happen if there are changes in, again, prices or relative prices or income, and that people are going to act in a predictable way. But what does Dostoevsky say about that? Maybe that helps explain the vote. People say, okay, I know that this is what motivates you. I know you're going to vote not for Brexit. I know you're going to vote for Clinton and not for Trump. Dostoevsky said that to show individuality sometimes, it depends on surprise, right? You'd say something about why you're not a piano key, which is what he said, or an organ stop.
If somebody says to you, listen, I know your psychology. I know exactly how you're going to behave. You can't surprise me. I know you inside and out. And you reply, how can you say you know me? I mean, yes, I knew you were going to say that. You know. What do you mean you know? Yeah, I knew you were going to say that too. I mean, the essence of being human lies in the ability to surprise, to render untrue any external definition. Otherwise, you are a piano key or an organ stop just played upon by external forces, and there's no you there. And people will defend their existence as an agent, as having a you, which is not wholly determined from without. And if you try to tell them they are, they will react by saying, you think I'm always going to behave rationally according to my own self-interest? I will do something that's contrary to that in order to prove that I won't.
So there are a lot of people who voted in those two elections who took great joy that all the pundits were so wrong, right?
Yeah.
You know, the idea of piano key, you press a B flat, you press that, you know it's going to be a B flat. What happened was we were pressing B flats, and it was a you know, an E or an F or some other note. And that was Dostoevsky brilliantly in Notes from Underground, you know, tried to explain that. What does the underground man say? He says, I know my preferences. I know what makes me happy. But what really makes me happy is not doing things that make me happy, because that makes me human. Yeah. It's the unpredictability. And I think there was maybe something about that. A couple more examples, 10 minutes, a couple more examples. Development economics. In the beginning, we tell our stories. You talk about being at Stanford in the Center for Advanced Studies, Behavioral Sciences in the 90s, and you were the token humanist with all these economists and other social scientists from political science and psychology who were pretending they were economists trying to mathematicize their disciplines, and you talked about that. I told the story that I was a consultant for the World Bank. I worked in 17 different countries, and there's a lot of people who are much better development economists than I am who have written brilliant books over the last couple of years about how development economics hasn't worked out the way we thought. That particularly in Africa, and I work mainly in Africa, although in Asia as well, that applying that same economic policies somehow in Nigeria are also going to work in Tanzania, and they're going to work up in Sudan, and they're going to work down in Botswana. And that's been basically the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. That has been their approach: get the prices right, which means you get rid of government support prices and whatever, and you let the market supply equals demand. What about literature? If development economists immerse themselves in a nation's literature, you think they would be more effective with their policies? They mean well, but yet the results are not what we had hoped.
Well, you wouldn't just decide that, well, everyone in the Middle East is the same. They're all Middle Easterners. So you have your everyone in Africa, they're all Africans, right? So we have the same. But of course, there's an enormous variety of cultures there. It just looks the same to you because you're not part of it, right? And when you assume that people are all the same, you're typically assuming that they're all like you, that they're all like Americans, because what else could a rational person be like? And then you go to a culture and you find out that some of them behave that way, and in other cultures they don't behave that way, and something that will work in this culture will not work in theirs. I can think how after the fall of communism, you know, shock therapy towards a rapid market really did work in Poland and did not work in Russia. Well, anyone who knew the difference between, you know, Poland's Western orientation and Russia's anti-Western orientation down to their, you know, to their bottom of their souls would have suspected that, that after 74 years of communism in addition, the sort of thinking that you have to make a market economy work would be counterintuitive there and would not necessarily be in, let's say, the Czech Republic, right? And I suspect that in each, you get a plan that might work in one part of one African country, and you assume it's going to work all over Africa, and you find out it's not scalable. It doesn't, because the people are different, right? And there is no universal solution. And if you study culture, and literature is a really good way of putting yourself in the perspective, not just from the outside, but you empathize with people from within. And the more you empathize with people from within and learn how to think the way they do, feel the way they do, you can just tell when something is just not going to fly.
And literature gives you that insight, right? I gave a talk. I was in Beijing and Seoul 2 weeks ago, and I gave a talk very similar to this. I missed you, so I tried to do both parts, which is like my left hand, my right hand. But anyway, I told the story in both of those stops that as someone who does applied econometrics, I get a lot of students who are econ math double majors, or they're engineers who are also picking up some econ or statistics and other things that I teach. And so many of them saw come up to me and they say, you know, okay, it's the quarter system in Northwestern. Some of them take 48 classes as opposed to where I was at Williams was 32. So what do I do with those extra classes? And they're always saying, well, what's another math course I should take, another econ, another statistics course? I say, what are you going to do with your life? And a lot of them say, well, I want to work in India, I want to work in China, I want to work in Vietnam, Indonesia. And I say, you know what? Your empirical skills are very well defined. If you want to work in China, this is what you do for your last quarter at Northwestern. Take a course in Chinese history, take a course in Chinese philosophy, take a course in Chinese religion, take a course in
the great Chinese novels,
literature, you know, language. God forbid, learn Mandarin. Hey, wouldn't that be a good idea? You know, take art, take music, because that's cultural literacy, right? So, and you know, and is anything better than literature to teach cultural literacy?
Well, the reason that literature is so good, and by literature, I tend to focus on the great realist novels of the 19th century. What those books do is they developed a way of getting you to follow a character's thoughts from within. You trace it second by second, moment by moment, over and over again, character after character, hundreds and hundreds of pages. You can get inside their heads, that's the technique, in a way you can't with people even in real life. And when you've done that over and over again, you learn to empathize as a habit. You begin to see from other points of view. Other disciplines can tell you, you know, it would be good to see things from other point of view, to empathize. But literature, great literature, actually gives you practice for hour after hour in doing it till it becomes second nature. And it's that practice, that ability to get inside the head of somebody else, the appreciation of what you learn if you do, that is the principal thing that literature teaches. It's not a matter of which particular novel. All of them, all the great ones will do that for you, from Jane Austen on. And that habit itself, which, you know, people who think they have, you know, those people I met in the Center for Behavioral Sciences who thought their models would explain everything, they wouldn't be able to think that if they could start seeing all the differences among people from different cultures, you know, genders, professions, even different people within our own culture, different generations tend to have ways of different thinking. That would be second nature to you to ask that if what you did was read a lot of great novels.
One quick question, then we're going to open it up for the audience questions. So Adam Smith must be spinning in his grave, right? 1776, he created the field of economics with Wealth and Nations. Economic man, economic rationality, you know, self-interest, not even enlightenment, but self-interest and all. And then here we're saying that economics can learn from the humanities. I mean, what would Adam Smith react to this? Isn't this 180 degrees different from what Adam Smith wanted in 1776?
Actually, it's exactly what Adam Smith wanted. The vision of Adam Smith that economists present is based on about 2 paragraphs from the Wealth of Nations. And they accurately represent those 2 paragraphs.
Laissez-faire, you know, no governments, self-interest, exactly.
But
small part of the book.
The rest of the Wealth of Nations, and another book that he wrote, which he thought of as just as important, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. 17
years earlier, right.
And then he brought out more editions to the end of his life, so both before and after the Wealth of Nations.
And what did he write in Theory of Moral Sentiments?
The main point of that book is that people really are not just selfish, they genuinely care about others. Now, and it's not, he knows the argument, well, that's really a form of selfishness because by caring about others, I'll anticipate my own problems. It's just selfishness disguised. The whole point of the book is to say that is not true.
Right.
That, as he puts it, care for others, sympathy and empathy are what he calls original passions. That is, they cannot be reduced to anything else.
Right.
We are both selfish and empathetic to the core. And it's not, neither one can be reduced to the other. And to understand human beings, you have to understand both. And ethical behavior that is genuinely derives from empathy is real. It's real. It's not just disguised self-interest. And the economists who just take those two paragraphs from Adam Smith are misrepresenting their founder.
So we're arguing, Saul, in an important sense, this is a return to the original creator of the field that somehow got lost over the centuries. And this, in fact, is really very, I mean, this is not Wealth of Nations, trust me, but it's a book that really argues that the fundamental thinking of the creator of the field has been lost over time, and it really is trying to bring it back to the original sensibility that has been lost in economics over the last 250 years. Thank you. We'll open it up to the audience. We have mics coming around, and a number of hands are already up, so yeah.
Hi, that was wonderful. So actually my question for you is, now having hung around closely with an economist for 8 years, how has it affected your teaching and your writing?
I'm sorry, I'm not catching what you're saying. So
I say, now that you've hung around with an economist for 8 or 9 years, how has it affected your writing and your research?
how does it affect my research to hang around with economists?
Your writing and your research and your teaching.
Yeah. And not your writing, presumably, with me as an economist, but your own writing. I mean, you continue to do, you did this great translation of Anna Karenina, where you changed the opening line very famously, and all, because it had been mistranslated, you argue. So you're still doing all your literary criticism. That's a great question. Not when you go into economics, but do you do it? Have I had any impact on you? Has it all been bad? I mean, great. Answer the question.
Can I keep my job?
If only you have tenure.
Well, it really is enriching to look at social problems, as I do. I don't just do literary criticism by analyzing texts at a very close range, in a purely linguistic way. It really does help to see things from different points of view, and I learned a lot of economics from teaching this class together, and I can see solutions to problems that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. The Coase theorem in particular, which we did in class, taught me, ways of thinking about how to adjudicate differences that would not have been obvious to me before. I mean, and that's kind of hopeful to have those kind of tools there. So any really strong discipline will offer you a kind of wisdom that you can apply elsewhere, and economics has a lot to offer. I know I would love to see my colleagues in literature, be able to use those tools. They would think more rationally.
Other questions? Sure.
Yeah, so what has the reception been by your colleagues in coming from your individual disciplines?
There's two groups of people who hate the book: humanists and economists. We didn't get into it, but we have this, Saul has this very interesting critique of the way a lot of literature is taught in colleges and in high schools before that, not as a source of empathy and critical understanding and cultural literacy, but in a very different way, because Saul might want to say a little bit about that. In my field, it's been pretty much really negative. I debated an old friend of mine, Larry Summers, a couple weeks ago about this, and his supposition was there's no value whatsoever to the book. It's a pretty interesting view. I argued otherwise.
He only read the one page that he's mentioned.
I know. He's very angry because Larry Summers signed a memo when he was chief economist of the World Bank saying that all toxic waste should go to Central Africa because the people are going to die there anyway. So, yeah, that's what's wrong with economics, I got to tell you. So that's in the book, and he actually got up at a public thing a couple weeks ago and said, Morty wrote a book about my memo. You know, it's paragraph and a half out of 298 pages, but as someone pointed out, the memo he signed and he claims didn't read it was 8 pages. If he didn't read 8, he's not going to read 298, but anyway. So I also presented it to my department. It was pretty scathing. You know, that's why we wrote the book. Economists are, very arrogant, and it's hard to realize why they are, because their job they do isn't all that good. But yeah, so it's been really, really quite negative. Do you want to say something about the humanists? Oh my God.
Yeah, on the college level, literary critics have been saying now for 30-odd years that there is no such thing as great literature. There are things called great literature because hegemonic forces of oppression tell you it's great for their own interested purposes, but there really isn't any. They're just cultural artifacts are all the same. Well, if you really believe that, why take a literature class? And then they wonder, why are enrollments in literature classes going down? Maybe the students are smart enough to react rationally to what the literature professors are saying. What makes literature badly taught on more elementary levels, so that most of my students have never had a literature class that they enjoyed, as what high school kids do. I mean, the high school teachers, they can do it technically. Let's find a lot of symbols. That's about 2/3 of literature classes. Another will be, let's judge these characters or this author according to today's standards. Wasn't progressive enough on this, didn't recycle. In which case, you guarantee you can't learn anything, right? Because you presume your own beliefs have to be the only correct ones, right? And the third one that they typically use is, let's read Dickens as a historical document, as a document of its time showing, let's say, the bad labor conditions of the time. Well, you can do that, of course, but I would suspect a factory surveyor's report would do even better for that purpose. What makes it a great work is that you can learn something from it without caring at all about the context in which it was put. That's what distinguishes great literature from other literature. If the students don't learn why they can learn something they can't get anywhere else, why it's important to read the whole book, not just a simple paraphrase of its message, and really love doing it, that's what literature teachers at high school or college ought to be doing. If they're doing anything else, it's understandable that students don't see the point of reading literature and don't want to read anymore.
Now, fortunately, there are a couple of people on both sides, literature and economics, who, for whatever reason, really like the book. So there are some people who are literary critics who think this is a great new way to understand literature and to value literature, and which I think ultimately could help their enrollments at all. And there are a couple of economists led by Robert Schiller, who actually spoke at the festival here on Wednesday. And he's going around, he has a quote here, and he's now, so he won the Nobel Prize, he's got great credibility, he's a brilliant macroeconomist. And Bob has this view that bringing narrative into economics. In fact, the talk he gave here on Wednesday, I don't know if anybody went to, I think it was called, Stories in Economics or something. So when you got a Nobel Prize winner, who thinks this is really an interesting way of returning to Adam Smith, that helps. And there are a couple of other economists who've been very kind. But to be honest, it's the reaction is pretty much as expected. The humanists, I find it very insulting, and economists find it really stupid. So. What can you do?
And those are the ones who pay attention. Most of them ignore it.
Yeah, well, at least they're reading it. The worst thing is, of course, to be ignored, right? So.
So my daughter is an art history major at Stanford, and she says at Stanford there's a real divide between those who in the humanities who are called fuzzies and those in other fields that are called techies, and they're really looked down upon. And she said that she has a lot of friends who want to major in humanities at Stanford, but their parents really push them to more hard, science-type fields, including economics, in their view. And I'm just wondering, as both scholars and being a university professor, what can be done to help sort of keep the humanities alive and vibrant and relevant?
Well, maybe I go first, and you go. The good news is I believe in markets, and I think that 45% of the faculty at Stanford, tenured faculty in the main undergraduate unit, are in the humanities. They only get 15% of the enrollment, right? So that's the problem. Everybody's doing the STEM fields, particularly engineering at Stanford, where I think it's now 48% of the students have at least a double major in the School of Engineering there. There's a supply and demand imbalance eventually. I really think that the best way to be protected against outsourcing to a low-cost producer in Bangalore or somewhere outside of Shanghai is to have some cultural literacy. This is what I talked about in Korea a week and a half ago. I mean, I think the way I'm a labor economist. This is what I work on when I don't have fun with my literature colleague. This is what I actually work on. And if you look at the changes in the rates of returns to different forms of accumulation of human capital, technical skills, it's starting to come back now. And it's because of scarcity, because a lot of the kids, their parents or themselves, they're afraid to do it, so that raises the value. And also because a lot of the engineering and technical skills are very easy to be, automated away or to outsourced. So what's the best protection about future changes in the labor force is to have some global understanding. The most important thing is to have the humility to know you have to educate yourself for a lifetime and the skills to do that education. But more specific than that, and now you're starting to see a rebound in the remuneration for people with humanities degrees. And we went over in one direction. So I'm very optimistic about the future for humanities enrollments if the humanists can get their act together and teach literature the way Saul does. The single biggest course we have at Stanford, the most common experience, as you know, for an undergrad is taken engineering. At Harvard, it's taken Ec10, it's economics. Everybody's getting. He is the most ubiquitous experience. A third of all of the seniors who graduate Northwestern take Russian literature with him. He's teaching a course now, Russian literature. What's your enrollment now?
About 400.
400 he has in there, 400. So I have alums and trustees, sometimes they come up to me and they say, I don't know, Mort, these other schools, these peer institutions, they're teaching coding and they're teaching math and all this, this single big, I said, yeah, I got to tell you, as a labor economist, the best preparation for the world, for your life, not only to enjoy your life, to be successful in the labor market, is to study Russian literature the way he teaches it.
Well,
Saul.
The applause should be for Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Look, students, if you show what these books have to offer, the deep wisdom that you can't get anywhere else, they follow. Look, you read Anna Karenina and you learn a great deal about the nature of love. Every student can benefit from that, and they know it. You read Dostoevsky, you learn about what makes a life meaningful. What makes choices that they have to do every day. Where should they be putting how should they be looking at their friends? What criteria should they use in deciding on whom to marry, whether to marry, what sort of career to have? Where do you get the criteria? You don't get this from your economics class. It presumes you have the criteria there. Mm-hmm. And they know they can make a lot of mistakes. These are the greatest minds in the history of the world are writing about this. They have something to say. They won't give you a guaranteed right answer, but they'll help you think about it more deeply. And since the questions like, what is a meaningful life, what sort of love should we be looking for? These questions do not depend on technology. So the answers given in ancient Greece are not outmoded because of new technology, nor in Tolstoy's time. There's a great deal, those sorts of questions, you can go to the great Chinese novels, you can go to the great Indian epics. That's how I'd really like to see world literature taught. The great works from around the world, all of which have something, deep and meaningful to say. Teach them as carriers of great wisdom, and you help the students get the wisdom out of them, ask deeper questions. If you do that, they see the relevance of it. They're all going to fall in love. They all are going to try to find out what's meaningful work or a meaningful life. And they know that they can benefit from that. But if you teach it as, let's find another symbol, of course they're not going.
And so if you want to understand the manifestations of socioeconomic differences, what would you read? What do we do in our class?
Well, there's a passage in Anna Karenina that, where people
We do that too.
Yeah,
But what about Chekhov?
Well,
the short stories of Chekhov. So we do a couple of them in this class, and, enemies. You want to understand how rich people can make poorer people feel like less than they should, and how
the way two classes can look at each other.
the way lower income people look at rich people and they imagine slights that sometimes are unintentional. Read Chekhov. My God. You want social awareness? You want to be a better person and a better citizen? Nobody could teach you more than the short stories of Chekhov.
Yeah, Chekhov was the master of empathy, and that's, he could do that the way I think nobody else could ever do it.
I think we have time for a couple more, is that right?
I am sorry, we are out of time.
Okay.
But I'm really sorry. Just a reminder, we will have a book signing in the outer lobby, so thank you very much to our guests.
Thank you.
Thank you all.